The city of Nocturne was built on a foundation of elegant lies. Its gas lamps cast a honeyed glow on cobblestones that had been washed by rain and blood in equal measure, and its soaring silver spires were home to beings who had not drawn a true breath in centuries. For most of its human inhabitants, this was a simple fact of life, a manageable danger, like living on the slope of a dormant volcano. But for Ilara, it was a constant, suffocating pressure against her ribs. Her fear was a living thing, a shadow that clung to her own, stretching long and distorted in the very light meant to offer comfort. She worked in the royal archives, a cathedral of paper and silence, where the only dust was the slow decay of history. Here, surrounded by the tangible weight of the past, she felt a measure of safety. The vampires of the court, for all their power, had little interest in the brittle genealogies of forgotten mortal dukes. Her world was circumscribed by the library's heavy oak doors, the small two-room flat above a bakery that always smelled of warm bread and yeast, and the path between them. She walked this path only in the brightest hours of the day, her head down, her heart a frantic drum against the cage of her bones. She knew it was irrational, this visceral, all-consuming terror. Most vampires were civilized, bound by the king's laws, ancient and unyielding. But a memory, sharp and jagged as broken glass, was lodged in her mind from childhood, the splintering of a door, a scream that was her mother's, and 2 points of red light in the darkness of her own bedroom. They had been saved by the king's guard, but not before the fear had sunk its teeth into her, and it had never let go. So she lived a small life, a quiet life, a life of carefully curated safety. Her only true companions were the books she mended with reverent hands, and the small, tenacious plants she coaxed into life on her windowsill. They were, she thought, the opposite of the city's masters. They lived wholly in the sun, their existence a slow, patient, and visible miracle. From the highest tower of the Onyx Keep, the vampire king Kalan watched his city breathe. For 500 years, he had been its heart and its will, a solitary consciousness governing the intricate dance of predator and prey. He was a creature of stillness and silence, his emotions banked like embers deep within him, rarely stirred to more than a cool, detached vigilance. He had long ago made peace with the solitude of his existence. The fates, he believed, had overlooked him in their weaving of the red threads of connection. He was a king, a monument, a law, not a man who could be completed by another. Then he saw her. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the sky a brilliant, painful blue. She was in the market square, her head bowed over a stall of late-season apples, a stray lock of honey-brown hair catching the light. It was not her beauty that struck him, though she was fair. It was a sudden, violent jolt within his chest, a feeling akin to a dormant heart lurching back into a ragged, impossible rhythm. A single word bloomed in the silent space of his mind, a word from the old tongue, sacred and terrifying, Amora. My soul. The world narrowed to her. The clamor of the market, the scent of roasting chestnuts, the chatter of 1,000 lives, it all fell away. He could feel her. Not her thoughts, but the very texture of her being. He felt the quiet diligence in her, the deep well of kindness, the love she held for small, living things. And beneath it all, he felt her fear. It was not a fleeting anxiety, but a vast and profound ocean of it, cold and deep. It radiated from her in waves, and as the bond between them snapped into place, it washed over him, a phantom chill in his own ancient veins. He felt her terror of the dark, of the night, of him, of his kind. He did not move from the window for a long time after she had gathered her apples and hurried away, her shoulders hunched against the imagined dangers of a sunlit street. The connection thrummed inside him, a new and agonizing limb. For the first time in 5 centuries, the King of Nocturne felt a tremor of something he had long forgotten. It was not the cool calculus of power or the weight of duty. It was a raw, helpless, and utterly human ache. He had found the other half of his soul, and she was terrified of the monster he was. The irony was so profound, so cruel, it was almost a thing of beauty. He stood in his silent tower, the setting sun painting the city in hues of blood and fire, and understood that his reign over the city was a simple matter compared to the campaign he must now undertake, the slow, impossible siege of a single, frightened heart. He would have to unlearn 500 years of being a king and learn, somehow, to be a man worthy of her light. His first instinct was the one that had served him for centuries, direct, decisive action. He would present himself, explain the sacred connection between them, the immortal bond that was the deepest truth of their kind. He would show her she had nothing to fear from him, the absolute monarch of all she feared. It was a ruler's logic, born of absolute power and the naive assumption that truth, delivered with authority, would be enough to conquer fear. It was an assumption that shattered within moments of its inception. He waited until dusk had softened the city's edges, blurring the lines between stone and shadow. He knew her route, had watched her scurry along it from his distant perch, a small, warm point of life in the cooling twilight. He chose a quiet side street, one of the ancient, narrow veins of the city where the gas lamps seemed to hold their breath. He did not mean to frighten her. He shrouded his preternatural stillness, softened the edges of his presence, and stepped from a recessed doorway as she approached. He intended to speak her name, to simply say Alara. She saw him as a silhouette detaching itself from a deeper darkness. That was all it took. Her breath hitched in a sharp, audible gasp. A bag of groceries slipped from her grasp, apples and a loaf of bread thudding onto the damp cobblestones. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the gloom, fixed on him. He saw no recognition, no curiosity, only a primal, gut-deep terror that hollowed out her face and stole all the color from her skin. It was the terror of a mouse cornered by an owl, a raw, instinctual knowledge of predator and prey. In that instant, he was not Kaelan, the king. He was just a shape in the dark, the monster from her oldest nightmares. She didn't scream. Her fear was too profound for that. It choked the sound in her throat. She simply turned and fled, her footsteps a frantic, uneven patter on the stones, echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. Kaelan remained motionless, the scent of her terror clinging to the air like a bitter frost. The sound of her panicked flight was a physical blow. He looked down at the scattered groceries, the bruised apples, the broken bread. Mundane casualties of a catastrophic failure. He had approached her with the power of a king, and she had responded with the fear of a subject. He had revealed himself as a creature of the night, and she had run from him as if from death itself. He knelt, his movements unnaturally fluid, and gathered the fallen items. The apple in his palm was cool and smooth. A simple, living thing. He held it for a long moment, the scent of its flesh a stark contrast to the metallic tang of her fear. He understood then. The truth was not a key, it was a bludgeon. His nature, his very essence, was the core of her phobia. To tell her what he was, what she was to him, would be like trying to cure a fear of fire by throwing her into the sun. He walked back to the onyx keep through the winding streets of the city he commanded, the city that feared and revered him. But for the first time, he felt the weight of that fear not as a tool of power, but as an impassable wall between him and the one thing he now knew he could not live without. In his throne room, a cavern of polished obsidian and silver starlight, he set the bruised apple on the arm of his throne. It was a humble, ridiculous thing in a room built to intimidate empires. It was a reminder. A new strategy began to form in the silent, patient chambers of his mind. A strategy born not of power, but of its complete abdication. He could not approach her as a king, or a vampire, or even a man. He had to be less. He had to be a whisper, a hint, a suggestion. He would not besiege her heart with grand declarations. He would court her with silence, with distance, with the quiet, anonymous language of things she loved. He would become a ghost, a secret benefactor, a presence felt but never seen. He would learn her, not to possess her, but to understand her. He would lay a trail of gentle, beautiful things, and pray that one day, she might be willing to follow it, not to him, but to a place where she was no longer afraid. The king was dead. A gardener had to be born. The campaign began with a book. From his silent observations, Kaelan knew of Alara's reverence for the printed word, the careful way she handled the fragile spines in the archive. He also knew of her private passion, the one she nurtured on her small, sunny windowsill, botany. She loved the intricate, patient world of plants. So he found a book for her, a thing of impossible rarity. The Illuminated Herbal of Alistair Finch, a first edition from a defunct printing house, its pages filled with hand-painted illustrations of flora both real and imagined. It was a treasure that hadn't been seen outside a private collection in 300 years. He acquired it with the silent, effortless efficiency of a king. One morning, before the sun had even touched the highest spires of the city, he placed the leather-bound volume on her doorstep. It was wrapped simply in brown paper and tied with twine. No note, no name, no indication of its origin. He then retreated to the shadows of a rooftop across the narrow street, a place from which he could watch, unseen. It was an exercise in excruciating patience. He, who could cross a kingdom in a single night, waited for hours, utterly still, as the city slowly woke around him. He watched the baker below her flat open his shop, the scent of fresh bread a warm, human thing in the cool air. He watched the lamplighter extinguish the gas lamps. He watched the world turn toward the sun. When Alara finally opened her door to fetch her morning milk, she saw the parcel. He felt the ripple of her caution, a familiar tightening in her posture. She nudged it with her foot before bending to pick it up, her movements wary. Inside her flat, he could see her through the clean glass of her window as she unwrapped it. He saw the moment her eyes recognized the title. Her hands, which had been so tense, stilled on the cover. She traced the gold leaf lettering with a single, wondering finger. A slow, incredulous smile bloomed on her face, a radiant expression that seemed to light the entire room. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and the sight was a physical impact, a warmth spreading through his cold, still chest. He watched her for an hour as she sat by the window, turning the delicate pages with a tenderness he now ached to know for himself. The next offering was a pear. He had seen her admire the commice pears at a market stall, her gaze lingering, before she ultimately bought the cheaper, hardier Bosque variety. So he found the most perfect pear in the city, a specimen of sublime shape and color, its skin a flawless map of green and blush. That night, he scaled the wall of her building as easily as walking on a level floor and placed it on her windowsill, nestled amongst her small pots of herbs. The next morning, he watched her discover it. He saw her confusion, her brow furrowed as she looked down at the street, then up at the rooftops, as if seeking an explanation from the sky itself. She picked it up, her expression a mixture of bewilderment and a hesitant, quiet delight. He continued this silent, one-sided conversation for weeks. A skein of wool in the exact shade of twilight blue she had touched for a long moment in a weaver's shop. A small, perfect conch shell, its interior polished to a pearlescent sheen that whispered of a sea she had never seen. A single, flawless camellia, its petals the color of cream, left floating in her morning milk bottle. Each gift was small, anonymous, and deeply personal. They were whispers of attentiveness. "I see you. I know what brings you a moment of quiet joy." Alara, for her part, was caught in a strange emotional tide, moving between suspicion and a burgeoning, unfamiliar sense of being cared for. Her initial fear that she was being stalked slowly gave way to a different understanding. The gifts were never threatening. They were never lavish or demanding. They were gentle. They were thoughtful. They spoke of a watcher, yes, but a watcher with a kind and quiet eye. The city was a place of overt power, of grand gestures and dark pronouncements. This was the opposite. It was a secret language of small beauties. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long began to recede, just a fraction. It was still there, a baseline hum beneath the surface of her days, but it was no longer the only note she could hear. Now there was curiosity. There was wonder. There was the quiet, daily anticipation of what small magic might appear next. She began to feel as if she had a secret friend, a guardian spirit who communicated in flowers and books. Kalen watched the subtle transformation from his lonely vantage point. He saw the tension in her shoulders ease. He saw the way she began to walk with her head held a little higher, her eyes scanning not for threats, but for small wonders. He was teaching her that the world could hold unexpected kindness, that a shadow did not always have to contain a monster. He was starving her fear and feeding her wonder, one small, anonymous gift at a time. It was the slowest, most agonizingly delicate work of his long life, and every flicker of her quiet happiness was a victory more profound than any battle he had ever won. He was not winning a kingdom or conquering a heart. He was simply tending a small, fragile garden, hoping to earn the right to one day see it bloom. The shift was subtle, a change in the silent conversation that had become the rhythm of their lives. For weeks, Ilara had been the passive recipient of a string of quiet miracles. But the constancy of the kindness, its gentle and unerring precision, had begun to work on her like sun on a seed. The curiosity that had sprouted in the cracks of her fear was growing into something stronger, a desire to respond, to acknowledge the unseen presence that had so carefully and tenderly entered her life. She could not speak to it, could not see it, but she could answer in its own language. One afternoon, Kalen watched from his usual rooftop perch as she returned from the archives. She was carrying something small and green. Instead of going straight inside, she paused at her windowsill garden. With the same delicate care she gave her books, she placed a small, terracotta pot among the others. In it was a single wildflower, a common field daisy, its white petals open to the sky. It was a simple, humble thing, dwarfed by the architectural grandeur of the city. But to Kalen, it was a profound declaration. It was not a gift meant for her, it was a gift left for him. A thank you. A sign. A tentative hand reaching out into the unknown. From his vantage point, hundreds of feet away, he felt the impact of that small, white flower as if it had been planted directly in his chest. A fierce, possessive joy surged through him, so potent it was almost painful. For centuries, his world had been one of commands given and obeyed, of power exerted and acknowledged. This simple, silent gesture of reciprocity felt more significant than any treaty ever signed. It was the first word she had ever spoken to him, and it was beautiful. The daisy became their new medium. Every few days, a new wildflower would appear on her sill. A sprig of lavender, a bluebell, a stalk of Queen Anne's lace. They were her replies to his gifts, her acknowledgement of his presence. He began to leave things that complemented them. A beautiful glass vial for the lavender, a small ceramic bowl of water for the bluebell to float in. Their communication deepened, a silent, shared appreciation for the small, living beauties of the world. He was learning the contours of her soul through the things she cherished, and she, in turn, was learning to trust the kindness of a stranger she had never met. But Kalen knew this delicate, distant courtship could not last forever. It was a bridge, not a destination. The joy of her acknowledgement was now mingled with a deep, aching loneliness. He wanted to hear her voice. He wanted to see her smile directed at him, not at a book or a flower. He wanted to exist for her as more than just a benevolent phantom. He had to find a way to cross the chasm, to step out of the shadows and into her world. The problem remained himself. His true form was the embodiment of her deepest fears, the unnatural stillness, the pale cast of his skin, the faint, ancient chill that clung to him even in summer. To approach her as he was would be to undo all the careful work of the past months, to trample the fragile trust he had so painstakingly cultivated. He could not be the vampire king. So he would have to become someone else. The magic was old, a subtle art of glamour and illusion that his kind rarely used anymore. It was the art of seeming, of weaving a veil of perception over the truth. It would not change his nature, but it could change how she perceived him. In the solitude of his chambers, he began to practice. He willed the chill from his skin, forcing a phantom warmth to the surface. It felt like holding a fever at bay, a constant, draining effort. He softened the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face, blurring the edges of his cheekbones, warming the cool silver of his eyes to a softer gray. He forced himself to move with less preternatural grace, to adopt the minor imperfections of a human gait. He even learned to mimic the steady, rhythmic pulse of a human heart, a constant, dull drumming against his silent ribs that was both a reassurance and a lie. He called this creation Kale. Kale was a scholar, perhaps, or a traveler. He was quiet, a little awkward, unassuming. He was everything the vampire king was not. He was safe. The effort was immense. To hold the glamour for even an hour left him feeling drained, the illusion fraying at the edges of his concentration. But the thought of her, of hearing her say his assumed name, was a potent fuel. After a week of solitary practice, of becoming this other man, he was ready. He would risk a meeting, a chance encounter in the one place where their worlds might believably intersect, the sunlit, noisy, wonderfully human chaos of the city market. He chose a Saturday, when the market was at its most crowded. The press of mortal bodies, the cacophony of vendors hawking their wares, The dizzying mix of smells, it was an assault on his heightened senses, a world he normally avoided. But today, it was his camouflage. He saw her near a bookstall, her fingers drifting over the worn spines of second-hand novels. He took a breath he didn't need, the phantom heart in his chest hammering a nervous, artificial rhythm. Then, as Kale, he began to walk. He timed it perfectly. As she turned from the stall, a stack of books balanced precariously in her arms, he stumbled, bumping into her with a carefully calibrated clumsiness. It was not a hard impact, just enough to send her books tumbling to the dusty ground. "Oh, I am so sorry," he said, his voice pitched to sound flustered, mortal. Ilara startled, her body instinctively flinching away, her old fear a flash of lightning in her eyes. But when she looked up, she saw not a threat, but a man with kind, apologetic grey eyes and a dusting of colour in his cheeks, who looked just as mortified as she felt. "My apologies, truly," Kalen said, forcing himself to meet her gaze, the effort to hold the illusion making his palms sweat. "How clumsy of me." He immediately knelt to help her gather the books, his movements deliberately a little stiff, a little awkward. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same volume. The contact was electric. For Ilara, it was a simple, fleeting touch, but one that, to her astonishment, did not trigger the usual cascade of panic. His hand was warm, solid, human. For Kalen, her touch was a firebrand against his skin, a searing point of contact with the center of his universe. It took every ounce of his centuries of control not to freeze, not to reveal the cataclysmic effect her simple touch had on him. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft, a little breathless. "No harm done." He stacked the books and handed them back to her, their fingers brushing again. He allowed himself a small, shy smile. "I'm Kale," he said, the name feeling foreign and false on his tongue. "Ilara," she replied, and the sound of her voice saying her own name to him was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. "Well, Ilara," he said, "allow me to at least carry these for you. It's the least I can do for my oafishness." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her ingrained caution warring with the disarming normalcy of the encounter. Then, to his profound relief, she gave a small nod. "Thank you." He walked beside her through the crowded market, making quiet, unassuming conversation. He asked about the books she'd bought. He listened, truly listened, as she spoke about the author, her words hesitant at first, then flowing with more confidence as she realized he was genuinely interested. He walked her all the way to the door of her building, the scent of the bakery below a warm, welcoming cloud. He handed her the books at her doorstep. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Ilara," he said, his voice full of a sincerity that was not part of the illusion. "You too, Kale," she said, and she offered him a small, genuine smile. He watched her disappear inside, then he turned and walked away, the glamour already beginning to feel like a leaden cloak. He made it to a deserted alleyway before he allowed the illusion to drop, leaning against the cold brick wall, the phantom heartbeat ceasing, the warmth receding from his skin. He was exhausted, more drained than he'd been after any battle. But he was also incandescently alive. He had touched her. He had spoken to her. She had smiled at him. The lie he had constructed felt more real than the truth of his own throne. He was Kalen, the king. But for the first time, he wished with every fiber of his being that he could simply be Kale, the clumsy scholar who smelled of paper and sunlight. Their accidental meetings became a fragile, precious routine. Kalen, with the vast resources and intelligence network of a king, found it laughably easy to orchestrate these moments of serendipity. He learned that she visited the city's botanical conservatory on Thursday afternoons, seeking refuge among the green, living things. The next Thursday, Kale was there, sketching a fern in a small notebook, looking up with a surprised, pleased smile when she walked in. "Ilara, what a coincidence," he would say, the lie tasting a little less bitter each time. Their conversations unfolded slowly, like the petals of a cautious flower. He never pushed, never pried. He learned to ask gentle, open-ended questions, to create a space for her to fill with her own thoughts. He asked about her work at the archives, and listened, fascinated, as she spoke of the forgotten histories she uncovered, her voice losing its timidity and gaining a quiet passion. He asked her about the plants she loved, and she taught him the names of flowers he had only known as splashes of color on the landscape. She spoke of hellebores that bloomed in the winter, of the resilience of moss, of the way a climbing rose could conquer a stone wall. He saw the world through her eyes, a world of small, persistent life, of quiet, determined growth. For Alara, Kale was a revelation. He was the first person, the first man, whose presence did not feel like a threat. He was calm, he was attentive, and he listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had been. Her fear, that constant companion, seemed to recede when he was near. With him, she was not the frightened girl who flinched at shadows, she was Alara, an archivist with a love for botany and a quiet sense of humor he seemed to uniquely appreciate. She found herself looking forward to their encounters, a flutter of anticipation in her stomach that was entirely separate from anxiety. It was a new and dizzying feeling. She was beginning to trust him, and the realization was both a relief and a terror. Trust was a house she hadn't lived in for a very long time, and its rooms felt vast and unfamiliar. For Kaelin, these stolen hours were both paradise and torment. To be near her, to see the life and warmth in her face, to hear her laugh, it was a pleasure so acute it bordered on pain. But the effort of maintaining the glamour was immense. It was a constant, low-level drain on his will, a physical and mental exhaustion that gnawed at him. He had to consciously remember to breathe, to blink, to shift his weight. He had to suppress his heightened senses, which screamed at him with the overwhelming proximity of her life force, the unique, intoxicating scent of her blood that was inextricably tied to the scent of her soul. He would leave their meetings and retreat to the cold silence of his keep, the phantom warmth of Kale bleeding away to leave him chilled and aching. The contrast between the vibrant, sunlit world he shared with her as a mortal man and the shadowed, silent reality of his own existence was a stark and brutal thing. His court began to notice the change in him. He was distracted, his attention distant during council meetings. His seneschal, an ancient vampire named Lucian who had served Kaelin's father, watched him with shrewd, worried eyes. "Your Majesty," Lucian said one night, his voice a dry rustle of old parchment, "the city grows restless. There are whispers from the old quarter. Your attention is divided." Kaelin stood at the great window of his throne room, looking down at the distant, glittering lights of the city. One of those lights was her window. "I am aware of my duties, Lucian." "Are you?" the old vampire pressed, his loyalty giving him the courage to be insolent. "Or are you preoccupied with this mortal archivist? We see you, my king. We see you walking in the sun, cloaked in an illusion unworthy of your station. You are playing at being human. It is a dangerous game." "It is no game," Kaelin said, his voice low and cold, the king returning for a brief, dangerous moment. "You will not speak of her again." Lucian bowed, but the disapproval lingered in the air. Kaelin knew he was right. The strain of his double life was beginning to show. He was neglecting his kingdom for the sake of a single mortal heart. He was a king playing the part of a commoner, and the effort was fracturing him. But the thought of giving it up, of returning to the empty centuries without her, was unthinkable. He was caught between the man he had to be and the man he wanted to be for her. He stood alone in the darkness, the king of Nocturne, feeling the profound, terrifying weight of a very human love, and for the first time in his long existence, he did not know what to do. The delicate peace of their burgeoning relationship was shattered by a brutal reminder of the world they truly inhabited. A rogue vampire, a young and reckless fledgling from the outer territories, slipped past the city's wards. It was hungry and undisciplined, and its first kill was messy and public, a dockworker found in an alleyway, his body drained, his face a mask of terror. Fear, cold and familiar, descended upon the city like a winter fog. A curfew was enacted. The city guard, with their silver-chased pikes and grim faces, patrolled the streets in pairs. The human population locked their doors and shuttered their windows, the old, managed anxieties flaring into active terror. For Alara, it was as if her childhood nightmare had come back to life. The news of the killing sent a tremor of pure, unreasoning panic through her. The careful walls of safety she had built around herself crumbled to dust. Every shadow seemed to stretch, to lengthen into a menacing shape. Every sound outside her window was the footstep of a monster. She locked her door, bolted her shutters, and retreated into the small, terrified shell of her former self. The progress she had made, the trust she had begun to feel in the world, was erased in an instant. Kaelin felt her terror as a spike of ice in his own heart. The bond between them transmitted the raw, undiluted force of her panic, and it was agonizing. He was torn. His duty as king was clear. He was the ultimate authority, the final executioner. It was his responsibility to hunt this creature, to restore order and safety to his city. The predator in him, the ancient part of his being that understood power and violence, longed for the brutal simplicity of the hunt. But another part of him, the part that was now inextricably linked to Alara, wanted only to go to her. He wanted to be Kael, to knock on her door, to offer her comfort and reassurance, to sit with her in the lamplight until her fear subsided. He wanted to protect her personally, to be the shield between her and the darkness. He stood on the battlements of his keep, the cold night wind whipping his cloak around him, the city spread below like a field of scattered jewels. He could not be in two places at once. He could not be the monster hunter and the gentle scholar. He could not be Kaelin and Kael. In that moment, he understood the true cost of his deception. By hiding his nature from her, he had also hidden his ability to protect her. Kael could offer a warm hand and a kind word, but he could not stand against the thing she truly feared. Only the king could do that. He made his choice. Duty, for now, had to come first. Protecting her meant protecting everyone. He shed the mantle of Kael like a snake sheds its skin. The king returned, cold, focused, and lethal. He did not delegate the hunt to his guard. This was a personal affront, a violation of his peace. He moved through the city not as a man, but as a phantom. He was a whisper of shadow in the alleyways, a flicker of movement across the rooftops. He tracked the rogue by the scent of its fear and its hunger, a foul stench in the clean night air. The confrontation was swift and merciless. He found the fledgling in the old slaughterhouse district, crouched over another victim. Kaelin did not hesitate. There was no trial, no judgment. There was only the swift, brutal application of law. The fight was over in seconds. It was a blur of impossible speed and overwhelming force, a dance of silent, deadly violence. He was the apex predator, and the rogue was a child playing with fire. He returned to the keep, the rogue's death a cold, clean fact. But he felt no satisfaction, only a profound emptiness. The violence had been a necessary act, but it had also reminded him of the vast, bloody chasm that separated his world from hers. He could not go to her now, not with the scent of another vampire's death still clinging to him. So he did the only thing he could. He went to her street and took up his old, familiar vigil on the rooftop across from her window. He saw the single sliver of light that escaped through her bolted shutters. He could feel the frantic, terrified energy emanating from her flat. He could not comfort her, he could not speak to her, but he could watch over her. He stood there all night, a silent, unmoving gargoyle carved from shadow and stillness. He was the king, the monster, the source of all her fears. And he was her anonymous guardian, the only thing standing between her and the night. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. He watched the light in her window until it was finally extinguished, and then he watched over her darkness until the first grey light of dawn broke over the city, promising a sun he could not feel and a safety he had, for one night at least, secured for her. The next day, the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. News spread that the rogue had been dispatched by the king himself, its ashes scattered to the winds. The curfew was lifted. But the residue of fear lingered in the air. Kaelin waited until the afternoon, until the sun was high and bright, before he allowed himself to become Kael again. The transformation felt more difficult than ever, the warmth of the glamour a thin veneer over the cold reality of the previous night. He found Alara in the conservatory, sitting on a bench, her hands clenched in her lap, her face pale and drawn. She was surrounded by life, but she looked as if she hadn't slept in days. He approached her quietly, his heart, his real, still heart aching at the sight of her fragility. "Ilara?" She looked up, and the relief that washed over her face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Kael," she breathed, her voice thin and shaky. He sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them, though every instinct screamed at him to close the gap, to hold her, to absorb her fear into himself. "I was worried," he said, the understatement of his long life. "I heard what happened. That was all it took." The dam of her composure broke. The story of her childhood trauma, the memory she had kept locked away for so long, came pouring out of him. She spoke in a low, halting voice, her eyes fixed on some distant point in the past. She told him of the splintering door, the creature of impossible speed and strength, the chilling red eyes. She described her father fighting back, her mother's scream, the feeling of absolute helplessness as the monster had entered her own room. She spoke of the king's guard arriving like avenging angels, of the vampire turning to ash in a flash of silver light. "I know it's not rational," she whispered, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. "The king's laws are strict. Most of them, they live in peace. But I can't forget. To me, they are all that monster in my room. Unfeeling. Predatory. They look like us, but they're just empty things that hunger." Every word was a perfectly aimed dagger striking Kaelin's soul. She was describing his kind, his people, him. And she was not wrong. From her perspective, from the trauma she had endured, what else could she believe? He had spent weeks showing her kindness, only to have the fundamental truth of his nature confirmed as monstrous in her eyes. He sat beside her, a statue of feigned human sympathy, his own truth a scream trapped in his throat. What comfort could he offer? Any word of defense for his kind would sound hollow, self-serving. To agree with her would be to condemn himself. He was trapped in the lie of Kael, a prison of his own making. "He can't feel," she said, her voice trembling with a conviction born of deep trauma. "They can't. There's nothing inside them but the hunger and the cold. They can't love. They can't care. They only know how to take." Kaelin felt a coldness spread through him that had nothing to do with his vampiric nature. It was the chill of despair. He had believed that if he was patient enough, gentle enough, he could build a bridge of trust that would one day be strong enough to bear the weight of his reality. But he saw now that he had not been building a bridge, he had been decorating the edge of a chasm. The foundation of their connection was a lie. And the truth, he now realized, was not something he could gently introduce. It was a cataclysm she would have to survive. He could not go on as Kael. The deception was not just a strain, it was a betrayal. He was allowing her to care for a man who did not exist, while despising the man who did. It was a coward's path, and he was a king. He reached out, his movements slow, and gently placed his hand over hers. It was a calculated risk, the first time he had initiated touch. Her hands were ice-cold. She flinched but did not pull away. His glamoured hand was warm, steady. "You are safe now, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic offering in the face of her pain. He stayed with her until the colour returned to her cheeks and her trembling subsided. When he walked her home, he knew it was the last time he would ever walk that path as Kael. The game was over. He had to risk everything, the fragile trust, the tentative affection, the quiet joy he had found with her. He had to show her the monster and pray she could somehow see the man. He would grant her the ultimate power, the power to accept him or destroy him with her rejection. It was the only honest thing left to do. The next morning, a letter arrived for her. It was not left on her doorstep, but delivered by a royal courier, a crisp, cream-colored envelope sealed with a blank circle of black wax. Her name was written on the front in an elegant, archaic script she had only ever seen on ancient charters in the archive. There was no sender's name. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This felt different from the other anonymous gifts. This felt formal, significant. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. The note inside was brief, the same impeccable script on a single sheet of heavy paper. "Ilara. You know me as a whisper, a giver of small gifts. I ask for your trust one final time. Come to the Grand Conservatory tonight, at the last hour of twilight. I will be waiting in the orchid room. I wish to show you the truth. Please. Do not be afraid." There was no signature. But she knew. It was him. Her secret benefactor. The one who had left the book, the shell, the camellia. The one who knew the precise shade of her favorite color. A part of her, the old, cautious part, screamed at her to ignore it, to lock the door and hide. The conservatory at night was closed to the public. It would be dark, deserted. A perfect trap. But another, stronger part of her was compelled by a curiosity so profound it eclipsed her fear. The note was a plea, not a command. Please. Do not be afraid. For months, this presence had filled her small life with unexpected beauty. It had never asked for anything, had never threatened her. It had simply seen her. And then there was Kale. Kind, gentle Kale, who had become a fixture of quiet joy in her life. The two presences felt separate yet connected, two different forms of kindness that had entered her life at the same time. She owed it to the anonymous giver, and to herself, to understand. That evening, as the sun bled out of the sky, she walked to the grand conservatory. The great glass building was dark, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised purple sky. The main gates, usually locked, stood slightly ajar. She pushed one open, the sound of its creak unnervously loud in the silence. Inside, the air was warm, humid, and thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen blossoms. The familiar, sunlit space was transformed by the twilight, its pathways lost in deep pools of shadow. She followed the main path toward the central dome, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The orchid room was at the heart of the conservatory. She saw a faint, silvery light emanating from its entrance. She paused, her hand on the cool brass of the doorframe, and took a deep breath. Then she stepped inside. He was standing in the center of the room, bathed in the moonlight that streamed through the glass dome above. He was not Kale. The man before her was taller, his features sharper, more defined, as if carved from marble. The soft gray of Kale's eyes was gone, replaced by an intense, luminous silver that seemed to hold the light of ancient stars. He wore no glamour, no illusion. His skin was pale, his stillness absolute. He was beautiful, but it was a terrible, inhuman beauty, the beauty of a glacier or a perfect, deadly predator. He was the king of Nocturne. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his hands open at his sides in a gesture of utter vulnerability. He let her see him. All of him. The power, the age, the danger. And in his silver eyes, she saw an expression she recognized with a staggering, heart-stopping shock. It was the same quiet patience, the same gentle attentiveness, the same deep, aching loneliness she had seen in the eyes of Kale. The connection was instantaneous and devastating. The anonymous benefactor who knew her soul. Kale, the kind stranger who had earned her trust. The vampire king, the monster who ruled her world. They were not three separate beings. They were one. The truth of it settled over her, vast and terrifying and undeniable. The foundation of her world did not just crack, it disintegrated. Her first instinct was a tidal wave of pure, animal terror. It was the fear from her childhood, raw and undiluted. Her breath seized in her lungs. The room seemed to tilt, the exotic, alien shapes of the orchids swimming in her vision. She took a step back, her hand flying to her throat. Every nerve ending screamed at her to run, to flee from the monster in her room, the monster who was now in her heart. He saw the terror on her face. He felt it like a physical wound. A flicker of profound pain crossed his features, so swift she might have imagined it. But he did not move toward her. He did not try to explain, to soothe, to command. He remained perfectly still, granting her the space and the freedom to run. His silence was a profound act of respect. He was giving her the choice. He was letting her fear have its say. And so she stood, frozen on the precipice between her past and her future. She backed away another step, her body obeying the old, ingrained command to flee. But her eyes were locked on his. She saw the king, the powerful, ancient being whose kind had shattered her childhood. She saw the creature of the night, the embodiment of everything she had ever feared. But she also saw more. She saw the man who had noticed she loved botany and found her a book no one else could. She saw the man who had left a perfect pear on her windowsill because he knew it would make her smile. She saw the man who had accidentally bumped into her in the market, his apology so genuine, his eyes so kind. She saw Kale, who had listened to her talk about forgotten histories, who had made her laugh, who had held her hand when she was shaking with fear. She saw the being who had hunted down the rogue that terrified her, who had stood a silent, unseen watch over her all night long. The two images, the monster and the man, warred within her. How could they be the same? The monster was supposed to be cold, unfeeling, a creature of pure hunger. But the man in front of her, for all his terrifying power, looked as if he were the one who was breakable. His vulnerability was a raw, open thing in the moonlight. He was the king of a dark and powerful world, and he was standing before her as a supplicant, offering her his truth, and with it, the power to utterly destroy him. Her fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. It screamed that this was a trick, an elaborate illusion designed to trap her. It was the voice that had kept her safe, kept her small, for so many years. But for the first time, another voice answered it. It was a quieter voice, one that had been nourished by anonymous gifts and gentle conversations. It spoke of a kindness that had been constant and unwavering. It spoke of a patience that was profound. It spoke of the look in his eyes right now, a look of desperate, hopeful terror that mirrored her own. He hadn't lied to hurt her. He had lied to reach her. He had built the entire artifice of Kale not to deceive her, but to give her a space to feel safe. He had respected her fear so much that he had hidden himself from her, crafting a gentle path for her to walk, hoping it would one day lead her here, to this moment. All his unconventional courting, the books, the flowers, the chance meetings, had been a single, sustained act of translation. He was trying to speak her language, the language of sunlight and quiet things, because he knew his own native tongue was one she understood only as a scream. Love, she realized with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, was not an absence of fear. Love was the courage to move forward despite it. Love was not a feeling, it was an action. It was the painstaking effort to understand. And he had been trying to understand her, and to be understood by her, with a dedication that humbled her. Her heart was still pounding, a wild, panicked drum. But the rhythm was changing. Beneath the terror, a new beat was emerging, a deep, resonant thrum of recognition. She was not looking at a monster. She was looking at the other half of her own lonely soul. The silence in the orchid room stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken history and unrealized futures. Kalen remained motionless, a statue carved from hope and dread, his entire immortal existence held captive in the space of her hesitation. She took a breath. It was ragged, shallow, but it was a conscious choice. Her feet felt rooted to the floor, weighed down by the gravity of a lifetime of fear. But she thought of the single wildflower she had left on her windowsill, her first tentative step out of the shadows. It had been a small act of trust, a tiny rebellion against her own prison. This moment demanded a greater one. She lifted her foot. The movement was slow, agonizingly deliberate. She set it down a single pace closer to him. It was not a surrender. It was not a magical cure for the terror that still coiled in her belly. It was a beginning. A choice. It was a single, hesitant, monumentally brave step across the chasm that had separated their worlds. A tremor went through him. His perfect stillness broke. It was not a large movement, just a slight, involuntary tensing of his shoulders, a sharp intake of breath he did not need. His silver eyes, which had been filled with a terrible, patient sorrow, widened, and in their depths, a light kindled, a star being born in the ancient darkness. It was the light of a hope he had not dared to possess. He did not rush to close the remaining distance. He honored the courage of her single step by holding his ground, letting the choice, and the power, remain hers. Ilara looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the intricate, painful, beautiful truth. He was the king. He was a vampire. He was the darkness she had feared. And he was the man who had shown her, with painstaking, anonymous devotion, that she was worthy of being seen. He was the source of her oldest terror and her newest hope. He was a paradox, and perhaps, so was she. The small, frightened archivist, taking a step toward the immortal king. It was impossible. It was ridiculous. And it was the truest thing she had ever done. The long reign of her fear was not over, but for the first time, it no longer had a throne.